Why does stress feel so normal at work? Why do our minds always jump to the worst case scenario all the time? And what's it doing to our teams, to ourselves, when this becomes our new normal? Welcome to the Learn It All podcast, the show for today's leaders who want to get ahead and stay ahead because we believe great leaders aren't born or made, they're always in the making. I'm your host, Damon Lemby, a two-time best-selling author and CEO of Learn It, a live learning platform that has helped upskill over 2 million people over the past 3 decades. Today's guest is Derek Sloan, a licensed therapist, executive coach, and he's the founder of Bridge Leadership.
We need to be reminding ourselves and reminding those around us of hey, you're in your position for a reason. It wasn't happenstance. We didn't draw a random name out of the hat and put you in the role. It's like you can handle what you're facing now and then also future challenges. And so I think the way we talk to ourselves and the way we coach our team, we need to be cultivating self-efficacy.
Today, Derek and I will talk about how we have over 60,000 thoughts a day, and most of them are negative, what the 80% rule is, and how it can transform how you lead, the real cost of normalizing workplace stress, why vulnerability is a leadership superpower when it's done right, and how to spot fear-based thinking on your team. Studies have shown that we have about 60,000 thoughts a day, and most of them are negative. Why is our brain wired that way?
A lot of thoughts around this. One is this idea, you may have heard of it before, with negativity bias. And you hear that and you're like, ooh, that seems dark and gloomy. And the reality is of that 60,000 number, I'm more shocked by the number that goes along with it. That's 48,000 of that is negative. So 60,000 thoughts a day, 48,000 being negative. And so that shows you where the scales are kind of tipped toward the negative. And there's people who would say that that's, kind of like an evolutionary part of our genetic makeup to where it's all about preservation, right? It's like, how do I keep my human alive? It's like looking at everything as if it's going to be bad because it makes us more cautious. It makes us take a little bit more time to make a decision to go this way or that way if we're taking into account, hey, there could be potential danger there, or what could that lead to? And our mind is a lot of times to our detriment about 4 or 5 steps ahead, and it's already determined that, hey, at the end of that road is a bear. So let's just not even open the fence to start going down that road. And so people start kind of walking in this space of anxiety and stress. And again, I think that's a good way to think about it. It's our brain trying to help us, but it's not always helpful.
These days, leaders, I would say now more than ever, are under a lot of pressure. We live in times of uncertainty. I like to call it the post-trust world. So how does having a flood of negative thoughts like this impact how they show up both for themselves and for their teams?
It'd be one thing if negative thoughts stayed as negative thoughts. I think about it as like a lot of times our thoughts are, it's the starting point. Like oftentimes you and I, if you think about like what's the most recent negative thought that you've had, once you pinpoint that or decide that, there's probably some then negative emotions that popped up that wasn't out of nowhere. It's because, this negative thought, here's some emotions that go along with that. And then the emotions show up. Oh, well, here's some behaviors that follow through with that sequence of the negative thought, the negative emotion, the negative behavior. And so if you think about it in terms of even just leadership or leading a team, if you're in a bad headspace, that's going to show up in your emotions. Someone walks in your office unexpectedly, you've kind of got your agenda. You might lash out. You may say something that if you weren't in that negative headspace, you may have responded differently. And so you can just see this kind of showing up in thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And I think that's really where it gets challenging because you're going to have ample opportunities in a workplace that's under high pressure for that just to kind of start to be normalized and not challenged. And it's just like that's a rough spot to be in unless we kind of can disrupt that sequence.
Give me an example of having a situation where it's being normalized and not challenged.
Yeah, I think in an organization where I've worked with organizations where there's just been a very negative leader to where it wasn't just a bad day. It was just like, hey, this person's they've always been that way. And so you get people in the organization who just dismiss it in a way of like, well, classic Billy. That's just who
Yeah,
Billy
classic
is.
Billy.
That's what
Yeah.
Billy does. And it's almost like this deal with it. That's just who they are. It's normal. They're always going to be that way. And so I think sometimes people withhold feedback. Um, they keep people in positions too long. And then if Billy's in a high level of leadership, there's a lot of eyeballs on Billy who want to be where Billy is in the organization. They want to get promoted, they want to advance. And now it becomes modeled to where, oh, that's what being a leader in this organization must look like. So therefore, I don't have to keep my negative thoughts, emotions, behaviors in check because Billy doesn't keep his thoughts, emotions, behaviors in check. And so I think that the unhealthy part of it just gets the dysfunction gets normalized and not challenged and accepted. And that's a detriment, not only to Billy, but then also to everyone in the organization who comes in contact with Billy. Sorry for anybody named Billy who I'm picking on.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a doom loop if you think about it, and what it does to culture. Because yeah, first people have to deal with Billy, and this is how Billy always is, right? And Billy's a senior leader, and people aspire perhaps to be a senior leader, and they feel like okay, especially if they haven't been in a lot of other organizations, this is what it takes to be a senior leader, and so they model the behavior that Billy has, and it just is a downward spiral and definitely impacts the organization's culture. Now, Derek, you've created something that you call the 80% rule. Can you break that down for us, the 80% rule, and where does it come from?
Yeah, it comes from just a way of calling out what's happening and naming what's happening. And so it's really stooped back into what you first talked about with 60,000 thoughts in a day. 80% of those are negative. So 48,000 thoughts in a day being negative. Just one, an awareness around that. It's hard to really change something if there's not an awareness first. And so just recognizing this is normal. You're not your brain isn't broken. Your brain's doing what everyone in society is doing. Even if you think about the most optimistic person you've ever met. I had this teacher in high school who every time you saw her, she's bubbly, she's cheering, former cheerleader, and she's 40 years later, and I think she still thinks she's a cheerleader, just over the top optimistic. We could say about her, maybe she only has 42,000 negative thoughts of her 80,000, but it's still, or of her 60,000. And so it's still a enormous number, even for the most optimistic people. And so one, just recognizing everyone across the spectrum, from the most depressive, sad, miserable type, the Eeyores of the world, to the most optimistic, they have this happening. And so that's the first 80% rule. There's actually three 80% numbers I'm going to give you. The second is that, 80% of the fears never happen. So if this is something you're concerned about, statistically, it's actually higher. More recent research has shown that it's even higher than 80%. But more than 80% of the time, it doesn't even remotely happen. And I know that's been true for me. Has that been true for you?
It
Things that
has
you,
been it has been true for me.
yeah, things that you kind of have a concern about just doesn't pan out. And so in that moment, again, like real time, it's reminding yourself of like, okay, there's a high likelihood that this worst case scenario where my brain's taking this 4 or 5 steps ahead isn't, it's departed from reality. It's not realistic. And then the last number is, 80% of the time, actually situations turn out better than expected. And so if you think about it, even when of the 20% of the time something negative does happen, 80% of that 20% goes better than expected.
So what I hear you saying is that there's really three 80% rules. So first of all, 80% of all our thoughts are negative, and out of those 80% of negative thoughts, most of the time they don't even happen, right? So we're worrying about things that will never even occur. And then the third one is even if they do happen, they're not as bad as what we made them out to be. Is that
Correct.
about right?
You nailed it.
So Derek, if I'm a listener today and I'm saying, hey, you know what? Well, great. But you know what? The worst case scenario did pan out for me.
Mhm.
So I'm not buying this. How do you help that individual?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there is a reality where bad stuff does happen. This isn't this approach isn't toxic positivity to where it's like no negativity welcome. I like to think of it as, hey, there's absolutely painful parts of that, which is part of the human experience. What what getting this where this can impact us is we start to then have a negative experience, and therefore we think moving forward, this is what my new norm is, which again goes back to affecting everything. We filter everything through that. And actually it starts to happen with a cognitive distortion called mental filtering. And so we have a negative experience, therefore we let that play out, and it's almost like this fortune telling. Anything else moving forward is bad. And so that's what we want to stop. We don't want to say, no, you lost somebody. That's not negative. That's terrible. That's horrible. That is a real reality. And so we want to recognize things when they are painful, but we want to be able to recognize when sometimes our brain's working against us and labeling something as negative when in actuality it may not be.
What are some of the biggest traps that leaders fall into when they get themselves caught in negative thought patterns?
Let's say they get a text from a boss, hey, can we chat? The classic case example. I know where my mind has gone in the past when I've gotten that. It's like, what I'm running through, what did I do this week? What conversation did I have? What did I do that, because I'm definitely getting fired. It's like I ran 5 steps ahead, and it wasn't anything that was going to be a positive other side of that conversation. It was all negative. And so I think that that's one thing of, if you feel yourself having these patterns of anxiousness and stress, stress in the workplace is so normalized. It's like, when's the last time we just said, like, why am I stressed? What's causing this stress versus just, I'm overwhelmed, I'm stressed. That's part of working. That's part of life. I think just questioning and challenging that, because sometimes some of those stressful things, like maybe the boss wants to give you a promotion or talk about something actually positive, and it's eating away at you for no reason. And so in the workplace, like, I think, like, everybody should look at, not only am I stressed, because everyone's going to say yes to that. Take it a step further and say, what specifically am I stressed about? Make a list of it. Okay, is any of that anchored in reality, or is it fallen into this 80% number it's likely not going to happen? It's going to go better than expected.
Do you have, I want to see if we could tie it back to maybe a real world example of working with a customer. Do you have any examples of working with somebody where they said, hey, Derek, this is going on?
There was a situation in an organization in the banking world that I work with, and there was a leader who overwhelmed with stress. And when unpacking it, it wasn't that they were doing something wrong. The organization had promoted them to where they weren't a good fit for their new role. Okay.
See that a lot, don't we?
Yeah, you're
We get
promoted
a whole
to
conversation around that.
promoted to incompetence, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you were good at X, therefore you've got to be great at Y. It's like, okay, so it was that kind of situation. But this leader was taking it so personal. It's a me issue. I'm not trying hard enough, when they were excelling in their previous role. But now they're in the new role and they're feeling that incompetence. And it was a poor decision on the organization standpoint. But when unpacking the stress with that leader, able to identify, hey, this isn't something that you can do differently. You're not a good fit for this role in this particular season of the organization. So whenever the shift was made, there was a new role for this leader. Wasn't a demotion. It was, hey, here's the characteristics of this new role that line up a lot more close to where you were excelling before. But I think those kind of things can definitely feel like a demotion if it wasn't unpacked and recognized that, hey, the stress that you're feeling wasn't you. Had that leader taken that on and just played that out in their head and kind of sat with that, and we didn't talk about it. One, if they were continuing in that role, talk about burnout, talk about misery, talk about just not wanting to be at work or, leaving altogether, getting fired, whatever. I think just being able to identify where the root of the stress is behind it and depersonalizing, because all of us are very critical of ourselves. And so I think that's where this 80% can really help us pinpoint where should the stress be coming from or should be coming from.
I like what you said, that we're very critical of ourselves. And if you think about it, we're much more critical of ourselves than we are of others, right?
We would never in a million years think of saying the thing to somebody else that we say. It's like,
Totally.
I would feel like I
At
needed,
least I hope not.
yeah, I would feel like I needed to be locked up. It's like the cruelty of that, but we take it and we've gotten so used to it. Right. And it's one of those things to where we go there very quickly, especially if we're in a season or that's had some perpetual hardship or challenges, or there's a lot of physiological and psychological reasons for that too. We can talk about if you want.
The question I have for you is, I want to look at it from like an employee's perspective. Say that you're at this organization and you're looking around, and the stock market's going down. There's been layoffs at different organizations, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and you're not hearing a lot from your leadership. There's not a lot of communication of what's going on. So you're always looking at what's right around the corner, right? And you're making up things maybe even in your mind. What can leaders do to help alleviate some of that stress and uncertainty that their team members have going on?
It is very important to recognize what is within your realm to change. And there is, yes, people above us in an organization, but those people are not infallible. They have challenges, they have hardships, they have poor communication skills. And I could sit there and blame and say, if they would get this in order, then I would be in a better spot. And the part of that is you're just reminding yourself that you're stuck, because I'm sitting here waiting on them to provide something. So then therefore I can be in a better spot, or then therefore I could take a next step. So I would just say, if you could catch yourself, or if you find yourself in that moment right now as a leader, make a list. What is within my realm of change and what is not? The things that are outside of your realm of change, chances are you're spending a lot of time, energy, griping, moaning, stress over those things. And what you're doing to your brain is you think you're actually addressing something productive, because I'm talking about it to my spouse, or I'm talking about it with a coworker. It's like I'm talking about the dysfunction or talking about what I need, but I haven't done anything to get me closer to that. And so that the controllable side of your list, if you have the uncontrollable and the controllable side, those are the things. Giving feedback, maybe there is something within my role that I could be more efficient at, that I could take this step or that step. And I know of situations to where I've challenged leaders to do that, of like, hey, let's all that energy you're throwing out there in a shotgun approach in all these different areas. What if we got laser focused on your list of controllables, of things that you could change? And what that tends to do, it starts to, one, feel like progress, momentum. It makes those hard days more tolerable. I've seen leaders who they're knocking their controllable list out of the park. The organization, the leaders in the exact same spot, but yet they have this feeling of, hey, I'm actually doing something. I'm being proactive. I'm taking some initiative here, and that really does satisfy within us this. There's a lot that boxes that check psychologically. Autonomy, competency, that are definitely major motivators for us. And so we can actually be in a better spot even if the organization doesn't change or that leader's not ready to change. And so, but I do think that list of uncontrollables and controllables, and then making an active choice to spend your energy on what you can control, it could be a very important step for people.
I mean, one of the greatest books of all time is Viktor Frankl's In Search of Meaning.
Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, and Man's Search for Meaning. And I'll put a link in the show notes, but talk about uncontrollables and controllables, him at the concentration camp. Can you share with us, let's say, 3 controllables?
am I showing up at my best? And I think that that's very loaded. I think there's a physical health component there, sleep, rest. Am I caring for myself? Are all the ingredients there when I arrive at work to be able to do the task at hand? If I show up hungry, I know that may seem like a trivial example. If I show up lack of sleep, that's going to show up in my productivity. So I think one, am I showing up at my best? Am I showing up hopeful? Am I going in on the drive to work? Am I telling myself another Tuesday? It's going to be like every other Tuesday. And that's when I talked earlier about mental filtering. If you decide it's going to be a terrible day, guess what?
Terrible day.
You're going to find all the evidence in the world for it being a terrible day. Kind of back to what we talked about before of like, if you allow that thought to sit, the emotion's going to follow, the behavior's going to follow. You're actually going to, if you show up, and here's the wild thing, psychologically, if I show up at work and I've decided it's a terrible day and I start to struggle to find evidence for it being a terrible day, guess what? I may have some behaviors that create a terrible day because I need this thing to all be in alignment, and I need to make, I've already decided what it was going to be. And therefore I'm going to kind of create that reality. So yeah, am I showing up at my best? Am I showing up hopeful?
So let's start with, you said, am I showing up as my best? Am I hopeful? A third one I've seen to help alleviate some of the stress and uncertainty is just making sure that you're communicating and being as transparent as possible.
Yeah.
And I bring that up because I've had situations where team members have come to me. They felt psychologically safe enough to say, "Hey, Damon, I don't feel like we know enough about what's going on around here. What are our numbers at? What's the status of this project?" And that's one thing that's in the control of the leaders, is that they can share and communicate and be as transparent as possible. And when people have an understanding of what's going on and they're not behind the scenes making things up in their mind, like we talked about, I definitely think that has a big impact.
As you said that, the word that floods my mind is the vulnerability part. It's like, what is a healthy amount of vulnerability? And that can go a lot of different ways. Hey, I need to let my leader know that I'm struggling or I'm confused or that I have questions or I don't know the direction. Maybe the change management side of things didn't turn out as well as the consultant promised. Whatever it might be, like there's definitely the vulnerability piece. And I would say if you're a leader, so let's say that it's what is the controllable of someone or organization that has people under them that report to them, extremely important for you to have vulnerability with them. Time and time again, people are saying, I need more clarity on what my role is, and I want to see more vulnerability from my leader. It's like time and time again that shows up. And so having that as a priority, as top of mind, which goes against a lot of work cultures to where vulnerability is you raising your hand saying you can't do your job.
I was going to say, why do you think vulnerability is showing up as far as what people want to see from their leader?
Because they have their own struggles. Every leader has their own struggles, and it's comforting when you see other people in the same boat, like early on. So one of my, I have a private practice for therapy. And so through COVID, talk about a wild season. What I noticed early on with some of my clients that were anxiety ridden, early on in COVID, I saw this in numerous clients that their anxiety lessened. Their mood improved. Wasn't for everybody, but it was enough to where it made me pause and start to really consider some things and evaluate. And really what it was is the outside world started to match their internal world. The chaos they were seeing, the challenges, people, uncertainty, all those things that they've had their whole life, is now they got to visually see it out there, and it made them feel a bit more normal. Isn't that wild?
'Cause it wasn't just them who was experiencing
It
it.
wasn't just them. They didn't feel isolated, alone, weird, broken. So many people so many people feel like, "What's wrong?" "What am I doing wrong? What's wrong with me? I've gotta hide it. I've gotta" it takes a lot of energy to preserve an image we're trying to portray, and so so I think the vulnerability part, I think it normalizes people's experience, and there's been a lot of people who've worked in the corporate setting, and vulnerability is the last thing they saw modeled at the top, and that's I think that's a big reason for it. I think people want to, feel like what man, if I'm being led by someone I'll say it this way, I talk about this, quite a bit, but it's when you're thinking about being led by someone, it's or when you're thinking about leading someone, I'll say it that way, so I'll pause if we wanna edit this, so when you're thinking about leading someone, I love this I love this way of thinking about it, like, I wanna show them enough vulnerability to show them that I'm flesh and blood, that I bleed like them. I do not want to paint this picture that I'm bleeding out. It's like, how do I give them enough vulnerability to show that I'm human, but not that I'm over here about to take my last breath or that I'm drowning? And I've seen that's a spectrum. I've been in meetings where people went way in on vulnerability, and it was incredibly awkward. Not the
Share an
time and
example.
place.
Can you share a PG-13 example?
Yeah, redacting a lot of names and
Yeah.
companies, all that. Yeah, just I mean, talking about marital fights, like, "I just got out of the car and Nancy, you wouldn't da da da," and people are just like, "I thought we were here to talk about Q1, like, Q1 budget," It's it's that level of, hey, that's a different conversation than saying, "Hey, some stuff happened at home, I'm gonna ask Ted if you can jump in. I'm trying to get my mind, kinda shifted into work mode because I just kinda came out of a hard conversation at the house." Okay. That and maybe for some people, that's even more vulnerable than they wanna be, but that feels very different than going all in and venting in that space. But that's a big part. I think there does need to be a healthy amount of vulnerability, and as a leader, you really need to be mindful of who's on the receiving end of my vulnerability. Is it someone who they're going through a hardship and I know that, and all of a sudden I'm gonna dump my stuff on them and they can't even handle their own stuff right now for whatever reason? Like, we really need to think about who the audience is with this, but all those disclaimers, vulnerability is worth figuring out because people are desperate to see that.
What I hear you saying is that vulnerability is important because, one, people wanna be led by people who are authentic and genuine. Number 2, it's kind of a balance where you wanna be vulnerable, but also confident. So people don't wanna see you don't wanna look like you're bleeding out, but you also wanna look like that you're open to sharing, that you don't have all the answers figured out. And 3, it also takes a level of, emotional maturity, I mean, it's one thing saying, "Hey, I've got some issues at home, can you please take this?" And it's another one of just going way too deep on the conversation around it. So I totally agree with you on that. I wanna switch gears, kinda going back to fear and anxiety, and you talk about how it comes out in 4 different categories. Can you walk us through what those 4 different categories are in regard to fear and anxiety?
When it comes to fear and anxiety, oftentimes what happens with all of us, like, the brain gets 5 steps ahead. It's going to the extreme for self-preservation. It's chasing self-preservation. And in doing that, it's making whatever that future fear, the boogeyman, the bear, the thing that we're stressed about, it's making it so big and scary because it's really trying to get us to take note of it. Hey, around the corner, here it comes, it's coming. And so that starts the future fear starts to well up in us in the present. It's like this thing that's 4 weeks down the road, 1 week, the next day. It's like all of a sudden now my stomach's a little off, my legs are getting a little wobbly. And it's trying to really get our attention. And so I'll give you a great example. I'm in Kentucky, and when I was younger, we would go to Kings Island, which was in Cincinnati, an amusement park. and there is an Eiffel Tower at Kings Island, and it's not the Eiffel Tower or the height of it. I don't remember how tall it is. It's tall enough to where I don't love heights. Every time I'm sure if I went back today and I get on that elevator, it's like a couple minutes, up to the top. I'm at ground level. I step on the elevator. Guess what? My legs get a little wobbly. I'm still on the ground. I'm 3 feet from when my legs weren't wobbly before I got on the elevator, but I'm going up the elevator. My legs are, I'm telling myself, don't buckle your knees. The door's open. Now I'm already clammy. My legs are wobbly. I'm 15 feet from the rail, and there's a giant fence and a cage, and there's no way I could exit this thing. But my body is screaming that I'm in danger, And so before I'm ever to the edge of that, but all of my brain, for self-preservation reasons, made that show up in the present and really tried to get my attention. And so this connection between the big, bad, scary thing being a reality, it's really, I say it this way, it's like our brain makes our fear big and it makes our capacity small. So the divide between what I'm about to face and my skill set, my intelligence, my ability to handle it is diminished. So I make this thing huge, this monster big, and me small, when reality is probably here. I actually have experiences. I've gone up that elevator before. I've lived to tell the tale of going to the top of the Kings Island Eiffel Tower many times. And so I have experience, I have repetitions, I have experience, things I've gone through that have shown that I can do it. And so oftentimes what's helpful for people is remembering past experiences and also reminding yourself, hey, there's a high likelihood that that's not a big, bad, scary monster like you're telling yourself that it is. And so trying to kind of pull that back into a more realistic picture of what's going on, I think is very important.
So from a leadership perspective, I guess you could use the example of it's a situation where a leader lacks belief in themselves, right? Because it's this huge thing, and I'm the small, and I'm not able to handle this. When they don't feel like they're enough, or they think they can't handle something in front of them, how does that impact?
This idea of self-efficacy, it's really, psychologist Albert Bandura years ago in the 20th century kind of coined that and researched that extensively. I would say, self-efficacy is this belief in self, that there's something that I'm going to face in the future, a future role that I may be promoted into, a challenge, a new client, a new project. And this idea of self-efficacy is, hey, I may not have the answer to complete that project right now, or to accomplish said task. Self-efficacy is saying, but I have the history, a proven track record to be able to do that. I have a network of people. I have coworkers who have my back. I have a boss who has my back. I'm going to be able to figure out what the answer is or how to navigate that situation. And again, it's an aspiration to think through and to recognize, because some people are handicapped by this fear, by this anxiety, to where they're so worried about the project itself, again, that they've forgotten about their own history. And so I think we need to be reminding ourselves and reminding those around us of hey, you're in your position for a reason. It wasn't happenstance. We didn't draw a random name out of the hat and put you in the role. It's like you can handle what you're facing now, and then also future challenges. And so I think the way we talk to ourselves and the way we coach our team, we need to be cultivating self-efficacy. It's such an important part of people's well-being in the workplace.
So how can leaders, either for themselves or for their teams, help develop more self-efficacy?
So some people may be hearing efficacy, and they're like, one, that's a strange word we don't use every day.
And it's hard to say.
Yeah, I'm like, there's a lot going on there. And I'm from the South, and so I struggle with words anyway. So with self-efficacy, I think it is important if we can take a little bit of time to delineate that from self-confidence. They're two different things. Self-confidence is, you know, I am I am talented. That's self-confidence. Self-efficacy is I am talented at public speaking. It has a direction. And so when you think about the importance, both are important. It's important for people to know who they are and what they're good, like I am talented, like that kind of outlook on yourself. Like I have skills, I have ability, but the self-efficacy is a step further. It's but what are you gifted in? What are you talented at? And so how many times have you been in a coaching conversation, whether it's uh, an annual review, a great way to think about this for leaders. The feedback that we give if someone's doing a good job, a lot of times we build their confidence. We say, "Hey, the last year you did phenomenal. You did such a good job," and pat on the back, and they're out the door, and they're like, "Okay, but that felt kind of shallow. What was I good at?" And so being able to take it a step further into efficacy is saying, "Hey, man, the how quickly you turned around that project. Man, that was phenomenal. That allowed X to happen, Y to happen. That allowed him to do that, her to do that. Like that was amazing." You're speaking into efficacy there. And so as a leader, I think you want to be mindful of like the words that you choose. Am I abbreviating the benefit, or shortening the impact of my coaching with somebody by just building someone's confidence? Or am I actually building that efficacy? And that's going to be a step further. It's going to take more intentionality, but it's kind of a much, much deeper impact to that leader that you're leading.
I hear that sometimes around feedback too, right? Where you can't just say, "Hey, you did a good job," but you want to say, "You did a good job at this," because that comes across as, like you said, less shallow and deeper and more specific.
Yep. And I've heard leaders get offended by, I was told I did a good job, and they're bothered by that. They're like, because I'm left there with more questions, or their thing is, yeah, I'm about to go in an annual review. I've got my annual meeting coming up. They're going to pat me on the back and said I did a good job. I hate when they do that, and it's so funny when you think about that leader's thinking, I just instilled confidence and this wonderful meeting, and they walk away from it, but that the person on the receiving end of that, like you said, just feels a little shallow or off. And so I think it's worth all of us speaking to more specifics. And it shows as a leader that we're watching, that we're observing, because it took energy and effort to produce what that leader produced. And if me as their leader can name it, it shows that it was worth all the time, energy, and investment on their part to do it.
Yeah, because you're actually listening to what's going on and sharing feedback on that. Now, as far as watching and listening, as a leader, what can they do to help recognize when their team are going through negativity loops or fear-based behavior?
I had a friend one time, and he says it this way. He's in kind of a materials industry for construction. And I love this. I think a mentor of his would say this all the time. As a leader, if I think something's off, and instead of making assumptions, adopting the posture of listen to my people, they'll tell me everything I need to hear. Listen to my people, they'll tell me everything I need to hear. And it's like, I think those data points are all around us. And I think as a leader, it's being very intentional with, when you're in a conversation, what's being said, what's not being said, adopting curiosity with that, having questions and space for people to kind of pull out of their day to day and just process a little bit. Doing that in a group setting with a skilled facilitator is a very powerful experience. When you have a group of people who are mission minded, they're in alignment there, but they're going through some challenges and maybe they don't know how to verbalize it, or if getting in a space to where you can have that dialogue carved out into, Not asking you to stay after work today. We're going to prioritize that as part of our time together because the organization cares about you and your well-being. It's having time to do that and curiosity, just be in a listening posture and don't make those assumptions. As a leader, we want to fix it. We don't want our people to hurt. If you're a good leader, you don't want your people to hurt. If you do want them to hurt and you're in Kentucky or Florida, contact me and we can talk through counseling options. Might have some issues there. I say that jokingly, but having this posture of curiosity and carving out intentional space to listen well as a leader and not jump to conclusions or assumptions.
I had a great guest on, Gary Ridge, the famous CEO for WD-40, and that was one of the first things that he talked about. I guess there's some great quote, I think, from the Dalai Lama about if you can't help people, at least make sure that you're not hurting them. And that's one of the things that he talked about was just really caring for your people. Let's talk a little bit, Derek, about the work you do. What's your target customer and how do you help them?
It's a great question. Yeah. So my target customer are leaders who have a desire to enhance their culture, but maybe need some tools to be able to do that. Like, where do I start? What do I look for? How do I move the needle on this? Our company's been around decades and decades, and we're trying to elevate our culture. That's where the work that we do shines, because we come in from a standpoint with really people at the forefront of everything we do, from understanding of psychology, understanding of what motivates people, how to help people get out of their own way. Like the tools and the frameworks that we talk about are all evidence based, and so we bring that into the workplace, and that's where it's an involved. Everyone in that's involved. It's not just for this section of the organization. It's like, hey, if we're gonna move the needle on this, it's top down. And so that would be where I focus. And also have so the leadership company is called A Bridge Leadership, and it's pulling those worlds of mental health and psychology into organizational leadership together. And when I show up at an organization, I'm not showing up as a therapist. I'm showing up as a executive leader, consultant that has that in his background to pull from, like I said before, understanding people. But I still do a lot of clinical work too, with a private practice that I run and lead.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing that come across with the customers you're working with?
5-10 years ago, there was this trend of people showing up to the workplace, and there wasn't as strong of an expectation on the workplace to provide some psychological needs that needed to be met. There wasn't as much of a language for it. I think on the other side of COVID, organizations had to really take into account, hey, what are we doing for our people? And I do think the education around it, there's a lot of reasons, but people are now showing up to work with an expectation, not just for a paycheck, but to be cared for in a much stronger way. And so that's been a really interesting shift that, from the hats that I wear, I love to see, and I think it is important for a lot of reasons. But I do think the expectation of the employee has put a lot more pressure on organizations to get this right, and they're not as patient for an organization to get it right. The paycheck's not always going to keep them.
And speaking of COVID times, we've moved to this remote hybrid work environment. And these days, I believe the Gallup poll showed that we're only at like a 30% employee engagement, which is super low. And I think part of that has to do with loneliness and being remote. But I want to kind of put you on the spot. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that we can be as effective working remote and hybrid, or do you think that people's engagement levels would go up and their mental well-being would be better if they were back in the office more often with other people and not lonely or just by themselves sitting at home in their pajamas working?
It's probably a little bit industry specific, but I
Definitely.
think in a general sense, loneliness is the unspoken epidemic of the world right now. especially in our society. Like loneliness is a major, and I do think isolation is a big part of that. I think um, for people with certain challenges, whether it be to a diagnosable level or not, working at home in isolation and staying in your pajamas and staying in your room with the blinds pulled, like that is not helpful. That's just not helpful. It may feel nice in the moment, but long term, that's not helping them. So I definitely think there's creative ways through technology and intentionality on employers' part to you can have community without having to have in person all the time, like the hybrid options. And it does take a lot more creativity and experimentation on an organization's part if you don't have people showing up every day. But yeah, I think depending on I think some roles for some people are going to be way more challenging if they're not rubbing shoulders with other people.
There was a young lady who worked for me who was phenomenal for several years, and she moved on, and we still get along really well. And she's a millennial, and she really was looking for an opportunity to learn. It is hybrid and mostly remote now, but she was really excited to move to New York and work remote. And then when she came back and visited, she said, "I need to find a job that's in person, 3 or 4 days a week, because I miss happy hour. I miss seeing my coworkers. And even though I could be productive at home, there was, she just really enjoyed, from a personal perspective, being around people."
One of the key psychological need, just like we have basic human needs of food, water, the physical needs, um, shelter, all the things like the psychological one of the three major ones is relational. And so who do I have in my life who actually know what's going on? And oftentimes seeing someone, touching someone, that's a different level than on a screen. And so again, it's a major challenge for organizations to maintain that, because then even virtual, how many times do you do a virtual call and people have their camera off, but they have their mic on? Okay. You can see the drifting even further and further away from human connection, you know? And so I think if I was an organization that there was that remote option still, I would probably have some very clear guidelines as to what that entails, just to try to promote and preserve relational connection with people so they don't get isolated.
What is one piece of practical advice you could leave with our audience?
Where are you? When you're thinking about what you're going through, the season of your role, the season of the organization, it is really easy to go into and stay in that survival mode kind of space. And when we're in that space, we're not thriving. It's good for the short term, but if you feel the same that you felt for the last 2 years, that's doing a toll on you in a lot of ways that you may not even notice anymore. It may be so normalized that you just adapted to only getting 4.5 hours of sleep. And you get used to being that way, and so I would say make it a priority to take inventory of how are you doing, where are you at currently and how long you've been there. And then you've got to find some people to talk to. And it could be coworker. I'm not saying it's got to be a therapist, but find somebody to process through that stress with, because there's got to be some healthier ways just for your longevity and well-being. And that's going to better impact you and family, friends, everyone involved with you.
Thank you. And before we close out, I want to go back to your 80% rule. We were originally scheduled to record this a couple weeks ago. And then my son, Wally, had to go to the hospital. He had dizziness and it got really crazy. And I wanted to thank you because I was researching you and I was studying the 80% rule and all these negative thoughts. You immediately take things you could immediately take things to the worst case scenario, which in this case could have been spinal meningitis or it could have been a stroke. But scary stuff. And you and I were texting back and forth a little bit, but I forced myself to get out of that and not think about the worst case scenario. So that to me is a real world example of how this work that you do helps. And by the way, Wally is perfectly fine. And yeah, it was just something, tied to the flu. So that's a real world example right there of not letting your mind wander to the worst case scenario. And I don't know if I would have handled it as well. Very tough situation without your help. So I want to thank you for that and kind of want to recap our conversation. We talked about a lot of stuff, like you said. We talked about why our brains are wired for negativity. Again, your 80% role. We talked about the different categories of fear and how leaders can look at controllable things for them to help their team. So Derek, you've been great. And before I ask you where people can contact you with, as far as how you work with people, do you, on a one-on-one basis, do you do it virtually as well, or only with people in Kentucky?
No, all over the place. So, I go into organizations across the country, and ongoingly, there is a lot of virtual follow-up, but I love to kind of that human component. If it works out to kind of show up and be able to engage with people face to face, usually at the start, and then that, a couple times throughout those engagements, definitely do that. But it's a hybrid, so in person, and it's not just to Kentucky; it's all over the country.
But what if I'm just somebody who I've heard this conversation today, and I'm like, I really like this guy's approach. If I want to hire somebody in your position to have somebody to speak to get better at, overcoming this limiting beliefs that I have for myself. Is that the kind of customer you're looking for?
Yeah. So there's individuals, there's organizational teams that I work with, but then also one-off, a banker in the Midwest, who's just going through some stuff personally, professionally. They want to, I'm an executive coach, but then also, like I said, licensed therapist in Kentucky and Florida. And so, it's across the spectrum. There's a lot of individuals that I work with, and oftentimes what happens with that is the organization starts to see the change in that leader, and then more people get involved.
That's great. And so where should our audience connect with you at?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, and so you can find me there, just Derek Sloan. And then the podcast I have is called Mental Stillness, and talk about a lot of organizational business leadership topics and also the mental health component. And then abridgeleadership.com is where you can get access to all the things I mentioned as well.
So listeners, do me a favor, if you haven't already, rate and review Learn It on your favorite platform, the Learn It All podcast on your favorite platform. And also, if you or somebody is struggling with mental well-being or deal with a lot of fear and anxiety, send them this episode. I think there's several nuggets in here that they can learn for themselves and for their teams. So please do that. And until next time, everybody, please stay curious, keep learning, and have a great day. Take care.
When the market shifted in 2022, we immediately had to start monetizing because now the market's giving us this feedback, we need revenue. And now I was very fortunate to I've already have 3 ramped up salespeople on my team.